Right, ready to start reassembling this Retina Ia. Now, this is the body I'm dealing with at the moment. Everything's been cleaned. I've glued the leather back onto the front panel, so that's quite good. First job we need to do is start thinking about putting the struts back in. They've all been cleaned, so they need to be lubricated. So I've got some grease here. This is a synthetic grease. All I'm doing is doing these slots at the back where the rack closes up, and the slots on the front part the same. I've got some molybdenum here. This is the shutter release. So what I'm doing is just rub a little bit onto that shaft there. Doesn't need much, just a touch. I'll rub some on that face there. Sometimes if this tab for the shutter release is bent out of shape, it'll be rubbing on there while it's working. This one looks okay. Back to the body. The shutter release mechanism runs on this shaft here. So I'm just rubbing a little bit of molybdenum on there, just a touch, and we'll put its spring back. Its return spring here just goes down over that shaft. This shaft here, transmits the action of the cocking rack over to the shutter. That's the back part of it. So I'm just lubricating that. That drops into the body right here. There's a little hole at the back in the corner by the bellows that shaft drops into. And just check that that rotates smoothly, and it does. This is the little bracket that holds it in position, and it sits right there. Without disturbing that, I have the struts mechanism fully expanded. The shutter release is positioned like this. This has to drop over the shaft down there. So I'll get that on there first. Started. Swing the struts mechanism in and try to get it in there without disturbing that bracket, which I'd carefully left sitting at the back, and that wasn't exactly successful, so I'll pull it back out, put that bracket back down, that little hold down bracket, and have another go. It's doing its best to get away. That time it's successful, so that's just sitting loosely in place at the moment. A single screw goes through the top here, and it goes through that bracket that we've just put in place. There are 4 black screws. The 2 prettiest ones will go back in the film chamber. They're the ones that people will see. Of the less pretty ones, one can go on the top. That gets hidden underneath the cocking mechanism anyway, so we'll run that screw in. I didn't do that up tight, I just took the slack out of it. At the base of the camera, in the same position as this, except at the bottom, there's a little spacer like a thick washer it drops into that position. Now, getting that in is always entertaining. I normally slide it down the body, not quite like that. Slide it in like that. Get my tweezers underneath that struts and lift it. And let that washer slide back into position. If I look through the screw hole here, I can see just the very edge of that thing, that spacer. So I'm going to shift it across with the point of my tweezers, if I can. It's not shifting very conveniently. No, it's dropped out of place. Alright, back to the start. That time I can see halfway through there. That's good. Now with those 4 screws, one was particularly ugly, and it was that one, and it was particularly ugly because it was hard to move. It was well stuck into that because of the glue on the leather. So we can run that screw through there. Right, so now that struts can't fall out of place. There are 2 screws, here and here, to make sure that the struts are pushed back into place. And we'll drop those screws into place. If it will line up for me. Not playing the game, let's pop the other one in first. Just so I can see that one. It's not exactly falling into place there. Let me see if that hole's lined up correctly. That looks alright. That's it. That screw started, and will probably help keep everything else in line. This other one. Yes. Alright, 4 screws in position. Squeeze in the buttons top and bottom. Make sure that the shaft is lined up with the hole in the front cover. The front's a standard, and the bellows slide back into position nicely. So that's all good, that's all I need to achieve. So now I'll tighten the 4 screws up. You can close the back of the camera, extend the struts mechanism, that's ready to go. The shutter release shifts nicely. Here we have the clean focus mechanism main piece. It's where the helical runs. That's all been cleaned and it's just ready to go. So first thing I'm going to do is screw that to this front standard, making sure that these 2 arms, which are there to they're worked by the release buttons. If the focus is not set at infinity, they can't be pushed in, and so you can't rotate the release. The release buttons to fold the front, rather, I should say. Right, so one screw at each corner, nickel plated screws, countersunk, fairly large heads, not like any other on the camera. Alright, two in place. That'll hold itself up now while I pop the other two in. Close that front up, bit of extra space. Right, now those 4 screws can be nipped up. And we can put in the 4 screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. They're the black screws. Fairly long. I'll just get those 4 started. And when they're all started, I can run them home and tighten them up. Just pull the front out again. Latches into position nicely. Pop that to one side. Time for the focus helical assembly. This is the inner and outer. As I mentioned earlier, they have alignment marks. Now, there are various marks on here, but the one I'm most interested in at the moment are 2 lines here and here, which I expect to line up with 2 lines on this front piece, if I can just find it. Here and here. Now, when this is about flush with the front, those lines align. So now I've got to get that assembled. So it's just revolve this backwards slightly till you feel the threads pick up. Then roll it into position, and I'm checking my alignment. The marks on my inner are here, the marks on my outer helical are here, so I need to move it this way a couple of notches, one more I think. Right, at that point my lines line up. That's with the front virtually level, and that's where it was set. When you screw the 2 halves together like this, you'll often find that they'll bind up. That's if they're fresh out of the cleaner and all traces of oil and grease are gone. They'll be very stiff, they're rough. put a little drop of lighter fluid on there. It just acts as enough of a lubricant to allow you to work those two pieces together. And what you're doing at that stage is you are rubbing off any high spots, tiny bits of corrosion, oxidation, things of that nature, and the two brass surfaces will work quite well together. Once that's been done, you could take that apart, they'll assemble again dry and work fairly well, but we're going to actually lubricate that. What I use for doing this is some special grease for doing helicals, and I think it was called Helimax XP Optical and Instrument Helicoid Grease. It's just white, very soft grease. Sort of has the consistency of cold cream, I think, probably. Perhaps it is cold cream. Let's put a few spots on the helical and work that in. It feels good. I want some on this back surface here. That's where the helical drops into the mount. And two spots here and here where the holes are. That is where it lines up with the guide rails in the mount, and I want a little bit there, just a touch, so they don't bind up. You bring the camera back. Now I put an alignment mark here, two sharp lines. That's all. I always put that towards the bottom of the camera so I know which way I'm doing it. This should just drop into position, and it does. Now making sure that the focus, that the inner is sitting forward, proud of the rear, of the outer, so this doesn't bind up. We can put the plate on the top. Now I need to put a little bit of lubricant on this edge. That's where it holds down the outer helical, and it doesn't need much. It only fits on one way, just like that. I'm done with that helicoid grease now. Six countersunk screws. I didn't tighten that up, I just ran that down. You sometimes find these screws loose on cameras, and that's where the helical was unusually stiff, and the whoever was servicing it couldn't get the stiffness out, so cheated by loosening the screws slightly so that there was a bit more play. It's not the approved method. Alright, so they're all done up tight. Now I'm just checking the action now to make sure that moves smoothly and easily, and it does. Those screws are all done. Our next piece is the focus scale ring. And the focus scale ring, I have put two scratches through here to mark its position on the outer helical, so I know exactly where it goes, and that will maintain the correct focus, since the focus was correct before the camera was dismantled. Generally speaking, the focus will be correct as long as a reputable serviceman has been in before you, and not some butcher. These screws are just nipped up. Don't go mad tightening them, all you'll do is bugger things up. They're just to be nipped up, otherwise they will distort things. That moves very smoothly, that's good. This was very tight before we started, and it was all down to dirt and grease really, because there hasn't been any real mechanical change in the helical. All it is has been cleaned and lubricated. Two small screws. This spacing bracket, I suppose you call it, holds the shutter, stops it from rotating. The shutter has a screw on the back, fits right under there so that it's locked from rotating. That's good. Now we need to put in the front part of the transfer shaft. So I'm going to press in the button top and bottom and just fold that front up. Where's the piece? Even if you think you've got all the pieces ready for the display, you're always missing something. Right. So I'll put a touch of glue in here, grease in here, not glue. That wouldn't be very good. Yeah, transfer shaft, the gear fits there, so it needs a little bit of grease inside because it has to slide on this piece, and a touch at that front collar wouldn't hurt. That drops into position. Oh, I'm just going to put a smear on the front of that gear, around the hub in particular, where it bears up against this cover. Let's pull that focus thing down out of the way so I can get to it. That's it. We'll just bring this out where I can get to it easily. Two small screws. Chromed brass, easily scratched. As previously mentioned, take care with those. One here. I haven't done those screws up tight yet. Normally I'll put a bit of pressure against this with my thumb just to make sure this is pushed back, and nip up those screws. And that's because it doesn't need to be a tight fit against the rack and the shutter. A bit of backlash there is of no harm at all. In fact, it means it'll probably work smoother. But by keeping it back, you make sure that this housing is not rubbing on the focus ring. So that part of the job is done, and we can move on to something else. Right, time to fit the front door, I think. And we'll start here. A little touch of grease around the pins, top and bottom. They're paper washers. That little bit of grease will help keep them in place. At least that's the idea. A little bit of grease in the slot that the pins run in, top and bottom. I'll get the bottom pin in place, stretch the door upwards and drop the top pin in place. We have 2 screws and 1 washer. In this case I know that the washer went at the bottom, so we'll put 1 screw in at the top. This is the hinge pin screw. Run that up, do it up tight. At the other end, make sure the hole is lined up. Get my washer, slide it into that space. Once it's most of the way pushed in, you put your tweezers down there, that'll pull it in the rest of the way, line it up. There's our screw. Run that home. Nip that up tight. Now with the focus at infinity, we press our buttons top and bottom and the front should fold nicely and it opens smoothly too. Some cameras will pop open nicely when you press the button. That's probably the ideal and it's not very easily achievable. All that's required is that they release and you can get your thumb against it and pull the front open. So don't sweat if it doesn't pop. That's not important as long as it opens and closes. So that part's good. And I think we can do the rewind next, the film rewind button. Shaft. 1. 2. 3 pieces. And there's 1, 2, 3 screws. Now the 3rd screw is a special screw and you'll see that in a minute. I'll take the inner shaft. This has a spring on it. That spring gives it a bit of tension so that it doesn't slip up and down by itself. I'll put a little bit of grease around there. This fed in from the top. It seems a bit unusually tight. I'll just check what's going on there. That spring was a little bit distorted. Perhaps it's causing the problem. It's got a slight twist on the end. See if I can square that up. Back in a minute. Well, that spring was slightly distorted, but I was able to take it off, straighten it up, put it back, and it's all good. Now get this screw in place, snug that up, and there you see the inner and outer part slide smoothly, but they don't flop about. I just used the screw from the rewind knob there to hold that while I was playing with it. A touch of grease here wouldn't hurt at all. So this is the boss that holds it to the camera body. I'm just making sure that's greased. That's countersunk on one side, so that's the top. Don't just force the shaft in there, you'll end up bending things. Just going to lift this spring tab slightly to pop it over the shaft. There. That's the position the knob sits in when the knob's down and when the camera's being used. That revolves nice and smoothly. Drop that into the camera. 2 screws. Countersunk screws, same sizes as used elsewhere in the camera. And on this model there are 3 of them at the film advance end. That'll do nicely. Let's flip it over. On the underside, that's not as clean as I like down there. I'll just give that a little bit of a wipe with some solvent. That's better. I think that must have been missed in the clean-up. Right, at the base of the camera. Let's see what we want to get in first. The film advance shaft's a good thing to start with. With the film advance shaft there's a collar that goes in the bottom of the take-up spool, and that's about it. Open the back of the camera. Here's our take-up spool. That's been cleaned. The Ronsonol's fine for cleaning this, but be cautious about doing things like that if you're using something else in particular. Some plastics really don't like solvent of any sort. Better to clean that dry. So the bush drops in at this end, not the one with the slot in it, that gets driven from the top. The bush drops in there. That can go in the camera, bush side down of course. I'll close the back of the camera to keep it in place. Now this shaft, that should be lubricated. Again, we'll use the grease, the synthetic grease I had before. I'll rub that well into that spring, otherwise that tends to be stiff and bind up when it's, except winds up as you move the film advance lever. We want that to roll smoothly. I'll pull that back. I can rub grease into that shaft there. So that will revolve smoothly. That's good. Before you pop this into place, make sure that the spring is sitting in the groove here, because if it's not sitting in there, it won't go neatly into the bush, and if it won't go neatly into the bush, you have a bugger of a job getting it into place. Right, so I've got the back of the camera open, I'm holding the film spool in place roughly. I can drop the shaft in. Now with the 1A and 2A, the general way of doing this is that the slot here points to the end of the camera. If you put that there, everything will be, it's easier to find. There's no special reason it needs to be there. It's just a good convention, I suppose you'd say. And conventions are always helpful. You know where things are supposed to be, they're where you expect to find them, all is good. Right, we'll drop the 3 screws into here. Countersunk head screws, smaller than the ones used for the film rewind. Now I'm just looking here, that didn't pull up square, and that bush is not sitting over the shaft. I suspect that spring, which I told you we had to be careful to place, is not actually sitting where it should. So let me see. Here it is. That's better. That just dropped into place. Everything's nice and square. That spring was not sitting back in the slot correctly. Right, 1 screw in holds it neatly in place. It's 2 mates. Once they're all in position, nip those up tight. Job done. Next, we need to get in the latch that holds the film release button up in position. So I'll get prepared for that.